Hi, Karl.
Hi, Megan. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well.
I'm Megan McArdle. I am a senior editor at The Atlantic, and you are Karl Smith.
And I am a blogger at modelbehavior.com and a professor at UNC School of Government.
Okay, well, let's start by talking about an exciting topic: unemployment.
Okay.
Lane Kenworthy the other day wrote a post basically arguing that the problem with unemployment is that we didn't get to full employment, which he defined as less than 4%, because the Fed and other central banks were just too inflation hawkish, and we're keeping this otherwise extremely desirable goal from happening.
Right.
So I wonder, what do you think of this?
So, I mean, in general, I think that there is a point to be made that central banks are overly concerned about inflation and that they're a little bit too hawkish. I think, I read Lane's piece, and then I skimmed the piece that he was referring to in the Boston Review. I forget who wrote it. One of the things that was a bit odd there, and I don't like to totally tear into other columns without knowing exactly where they come from, but it seemed that they took sort of the what we might think of as a 1950s, 1960s view of the Phillips curve, which is that there's a permanent trade-off between inflation and unemployment, that if you just accept an inflation rate of, say, 9%, then you can always get an inflation or an unemployment rate of 3 or 4%, and that's pretty much I mean, I would go so far as to say discredited in the economics community. That's not anywhere close to a mainstream view, and I didn't even really know it was a minority view. So so I thought that was a bit
well,
odd.
as I was talking to a couple economists the other night at dinner, and they were like, well, you can always find someone who believes something, right? Like, basically,
Right.
You can, for any view, you can find one guy who has a PhD and also holds this view. But in general, yeah, my take as well. And now, of course, I'm 10 years out of school, so it's one of those things where, like, I started questioning myself. I was like, have there been advances in monetary policy that I somehow missed while covering the Fed for 10 years?
No, I don't think so. I mean, not that I'm aware of. And I mean, I think that, I read your piece, and I think that's more or less the standard view, which is that you have to, in order to get a reduction in unemployment, you have to have a surprising change in inflation. So the Fed has to print more money than people are expecting, or, for unemployment to go down, or less money than people are expecting for unemployment to go up. Some people sort of question that and have, what I might call, is similar to like the way I think about it. It's just pure accelerationist, So I don't know how geeky this is getting, but there's a slight difference.
Let's go full-frontal geeky.
Okay, full-frontal geeky. So there's a slight difference, I think, between thinking in terms of the natural rate of unemployment, which is sort of Milton Friedman's concept, saying that there's some natural rate that just is that predominates because it takes time for people to find a job, and it takes time for workers to figure out where they want to work and stuff like that, and that the Fed can muck with that by tricking people into thinking there's more demand out there than there really is by printing a bunch of money, or on the opposite end by printing too little money and tricking people into thinking that there's less demand than there is, and that so you can move around this natural rate, but you'll always eventually come back to it. I think the guys who talk about Nehru sometimes take a little bit more of a accelerationist view, which is that maybe somewhere deep down expectations are important, and we have these well-formed expectations, but as a practical matter, if you do what we think of as step on the gas, if you start pushing harder on monetary policy, then the rate of inflation will increase and the rate of unemployment will decrease. And if you retract, the rate of inflation will fall and the rate of employment will increase. And so rather than you getting really into the weeds about expectations, it's just a matter of like how hard you're pushing on the gas to get the economy going. But even in that view, you have to be accelerating inflation. So I think the Nehru stands for non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. So to get unemployment down, you have to not just increase the rate of inflation, or not just you have higher inflation, but you have to have higher inflation than whatever you've got now. And so if you wanted to keep unemployment way down forever, you would have to keep having higher and higher and higher and higher rates of inflation. So,
and as I think the people of Zimbabwe can attest, eventually this is not such a good idea. I thought it was interesting because this is not the first time I'd seen this argument, but it was the first time that I'd seen this argument from a social scientist. And so what I take is that this is a growing sort of trend in progressives, which is interesting to me because I'd always thought basically of conservatives as the kind of wellspring of crackpot monetary theory. But now, like, you not only have this, but you have James Galbraith, who is going around, and he has counterparts on the right now with the modern monetary theory people. But you basically have a bunch of people on the left and right going around and saying, including, the son of a pretty famous economist, although one who I will say, like, for all that I love Galbraith's works, I once asked one of my professors what school of thought he fell into, and he sort of paused and he was like, it's less of a school of thought than a kind of global conspiracy theory. But you've got, he's at UT, he's at a good school. He's basically going around saying that the U.S. government can just borrow unlimited amounts of money. That any amount of money that we care to borrow and spend, that will be fine. And that we won't stop being able to borrow this money, which just strikes me as sort of insane, right? Like, I mean, yes, it's true if you assume that you can just keep borrowing in your own currency forever. That's true, right? But that's a condition that doesn't just hold forever. We borrow in our own currency because people are willing to trust that we're not going to hyperinflate it and destroy the value of the dollar and destroy the value of their investment. And when you do that, then people stop lending to you in your own currency, and then the Federal Reserve buying your bonds doesn't really help because all you get is hyperinflation.
Yeah, I think that's more. I think that's more or less right. Though I would say that Jamie, the way he phrases things is such that more or less what he's saying is technically correct. So I think what he often says, or what he elaborates, he says that the real danger to the United States isn't that we'll somehow overborrow or have so much debt that we can't pay it off or that we can't meet the payments. The only real danger is higher inflation, right? Now, I mean, what he's sort of ignoring is that, if you take the paradigm that he's saying, or I don't even know if he's ignoring it, but he's, not making a big deal out of it, is that the danger is hyperinflation, right? So it's not just, there's some danger and maybe it's 10 or 12% inflation, but it's hyperinflation. And I haven't seen, I think he commented a couple times on something that we wrote about this, and I think he more or less recognizes that. He just thinks that it's foolish for people to be worried about it at this point, and so I think that as a technical matter, he wants to make a big deal out of the fact that he doesn't think that Treasury auctions will ever fail, that it'll ever be the case that the U.S. can't sell its Treasury bonds to banks, and I think he's probably right about that unless, he says, unless the Republic collapses, right? Though it's not inconceivable that, huge expansions in the money supply and hyperinflation could, in his terms, cause the Republic to collapse, could cause the dollar not to be accepted as currency. I don't know if that's... Well,
but I think it's actually beyond that. Because, the thing that you have to... So you say he's ignoring the risk of hyperinflation, and I think that that's correct. But I also think that the thing you have to remember about hyperinflation, right, is that ultimately, so to go really deep in the ultra-geeky weeds, right, the value of seigniorage, which for our viewers who do not spend this much time geeking out about monetary policy, is the revenue that the government gets by printing money. The value of that, actually, there's a point in hyperinflation where you start losing, right? And as we talked about, it has to keep accelerating. But the problem with this is that there's a point in hyperinflation where you actually where the value of the seigniorage starts going down. Right. So you stop making so much money. You have to keep printing more money in order to do all of these other effects, but you stop actually making as much revenue, if you can call it that, from the act of printing money that is soon going to be worthless. And actually, interestingly, the Laffer curve, as I understand it, was initially developed to describe that. It was not developed to describe the income tax. It was actually developed to describe what happened in Weimar Germany, where there was a point at which the government could actually make more money by printing less money.
Right.
And so, like, even the hyperinflation thing, even if you say, like, a bond auction will never fail, there will come a point at which the real revenue being derived from this hyperinflation will actually start to fall.
Right.
And so it's not actually something that you can do indefinitely in terms of financing real government consumption. It's something that you can do indefinitely if, like, all you're talking about is, can the government, like, make these weird nominal marks in its books showing the movement around of imaginary green pieces of paper. But that's not really very helpful.
Well, I mean, so, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's something like the Laffer curve for seniorage, much earlier. There's sort of a general concept that there's just a maximum amount of resources that the government can extract from its people, right? So you can't extract 100% of GDP in any way you want to do it. You can't do it through taxes. You can't do it through printing money. You can't do it through issuing debt. You're not going to be able to issue debt equal to 100% of GDP in any given year. And quite frankly, you can't even do it with confiscation at gunpoint. So, I mean, people are going to avoid having their stuff taken. And so...
Yeah, I believe Mao was really bitter about that, actually.
What'd you say?
He has all these bitter quotes about how, like, the Chinese peasants are not giving, like, when he sends soldiers in to take...
So no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to just completely... You're not going to be able to completely take.
Hi, Karl. Sorry about that, Internet, but apparently Skype decided it did not like what I was saying.
Okay.
So back to, I think this might actually be a good sort of entree into our next topic, which is deficit hawkery. You think that I am too hawkish. And
yes, I do. Did you want to say more, or do you want me to go ahead?
No. I want to hear. I want to give you the opportunity to present the case that I am too hawkish, and then I will like triumphantly refute it and retire victorious into my cave.
Okay, so I think around the time that the president's budget came out, there was, I forget the exact number, 1.2 trillion maybe dollars in deficit came out, and there was hand wringing all around. And I remember in particular you were saying that we can't take the Republicans seriously for these reasons, we can't take the Democrats seriously for these reasons, and so deficit hawks should just like get drunk and be depressed. And I thought that seemed completely counter to what I have been pushing for, and I felt some support from the blogosphere for a while, which was that we either needed to have more government spending to boost employment, or we needed to cut taxes to boost employment, and the natural consequence of that is that the deficit's going to go up, right? So I mean, if we're arguing for no matter which side, you might think of tax cuts as being more conservative and spending as being more liberal, but if you're arguing that we should have tax cuts or spending increases, you're arguing for a higher deficit in the short run. And so, when you then get a higher deficit in the short run, there's no reason to start crying about that. I mean, there's no reason for people to start being upset, and say, oh, doesn't this represent government irresponsibility? It represents the government doing exactly what we told it to do, which was cut taxes and spend more money. So I don't know. I mean, so that's why I thought that like the general feeling that the short-term deficits represented some failing or whatever were wrong. I mean, they represented a success.
Well, I will say a couple of things. It's more of a, as I said at the time, look, I would support stimulus because, why not try it?
Okay.
I would have voted for the package had I been in the Senate, even though, I thought it was not particularly well structured, right? There was too much hitting out too far. But, I'm more of a stimulus agnostic than most people. I understand it works really, really well in the models. I endorse and embrace the fact that when you run the models, the stimulus happens, right? But I think the empirical estimates of the stimulus are kind of underwhelming, right? I mean, they're all over the place. They're never the same twice. And so, I assume it's working at some level, but I'm not sure, given what this is doing to our balance sheets, that continued stimulus. I actually was against, the extension of the Bush tax cuts. I just wanted them to all expire. I didn't think that the bang we were getting from the stimulus, and I understood that would have been contractionary, but I also think that in a political economy sense, we haven't solved it, right? The ideal world would be we do this huge stimulus now, and at the same time, it's a package. And that package includes fixing it in 2015, right? But we're not fixing it in 2015. And given that we're not fixing it in 2015, we haven't, and that I am increasingly despairing of the possibility that we will, the way I see it is that we have to at least think seriously about the fact that even though in an ideal world we would be doing this now and fixing it later, in the real world we live in, we may do this now and not fix it later. And at that point, it might be better not to do this now. Given that I don't endorse multipliers of like 3. I think that doesn't strike me as a particularly likely number, looking at the sort of incredibly mixed empirical literature.
Right, and so I think for the audience, like if you got a multiplier of 3, so the idea is that we do some sort of stimulus. One of the things that upsets me, I think, a little bit, is that stimulus has just become completely tacked on to the notion of increased government spending, and not only was that not a complete description of the actual stimulus it had, it's not a description of textbook stimulus, right? So I mean, you could be 100% anti-government and 100% Keynesian, and just think that what the government needs to do during recession is have massive tax cuts. And you could argue,
in fairness, I have to say, like the people who are saying that. And who are getting, like, I don't understand why the Republicans are so against this. Well, when Bush did a classic Keynesian tax cut stimulus, they whined that it was tax cuts and that wasn't really stimulative and it was a terrible idea and we didn't need it. Right? Like, so, okay, well, you went out and told everyone that that this doesn't work, and now you're surprised that they're like, that they thought you meant it, and that you weren't just doing this strategically against tax cuts. But I think both sides do this. It's really like...
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's some of that. I mean, I think that, there's a little bit less, like if you read between the lines, there's a little bit less, I don't know if dishonesty is the right word, but then appears, or people allow the headlines to be much more egregious than they are. So when I push back against Brad DeLong and Krugman about this, saying that tax cuts are perfectly fine, and I suspect that the reason that you guys want them is because you want government spending anyway, they were like, no, we want government spending because the theoretical multiplier is higher, and that's true, but it's like mildly true. I mean, some
of Romer's work, who designed the damn stimulus. Some of her work shows that tax cuts do more. Like,
right.
I mean, admittedly, it's easier to get endogenous tax cuts than for the people watching, this is really getting deep into the weeds. But like, she did a study of different kinds of stimulus, and in order to control for the fact that like you frequently do stimulus when the economy is about to tank, so you don't really want to study like what happens if you spend a bunch of money just as the economy is going into recession. So what they did was they looked at stuff that didn't have anything to do with the economy. So when you do a big tax cut independently, or you do a big spending, thing, and there's no recession on, what happens afterwards? And her work actually found better multipliers for taxes in some cases. And then she went out, and people were, and she had to kind of fudge when she was asked about this, which is the sad, fate of any government advisor, is they have to fudge because their boss is not always going to do what they want them to do.
Well, to be fair, I think the Romer paper that I read, she got big multipliers. I think they were inching up on the 2 or 3 level when she looked at just tax cuts that, I think they used newspaper clippings to show these tax cuts were not for offsetting economic downturns. And they just looked at tax cuts. And those multipliers are bigger than anybody has gotten looking at spending. But she did say, recently after that she thinks, well, no, my point is just that multipliers are big, and that if we could do a spending multiplier, we would. And I think Robert Barrow, another economist, tried to do that with war spending. So, and
got really small multipliers for everything except war. But I would just say that, like, the administration's position was, tax multipliers are really small, and that was clearly not the implication of her work.
And it's not even the implication of the stuff. Like, they leaned a lot on Mark Zandi, and I remember reading his stuff, and, again, this is nerdy, but, like, I think he had on a payroll tax cut, he had a multiplier of, like, 1.2, and then on a spending, program, like a multiplier of, like, 1.7. Well, that's bigger. But it's not so much bigger that you would say, well, let's just screw these tax cuts, right? Only a fool would would want to cut tax cuts.
Especially when you consider how much faster you can move
Right.
a tax cut. Right, I mean, and this is not just true of tax cuts. This is true of certain kinds of spending.
Right.
So you can move welfare boosts really fast. You can move unemployment boosts really fast. Because they're basically, you just tell the machines, like, write bigger checks.
Right.
Or you extend the benefits. It's really easy to do. And then you compare that to, like, infrastructure spending, which was this fairly large component of the package, and everyone got really excited about it. Well, that moves really, really slowly. Like, my dad was lobbyist for the transportation industry in New York, for the heavy construction industry. They build, like, rail and bridges and so forth. And he estimates that adding federal money to a project adds 5 years.
Wow.
Because there's so much oversight and just complicated levels of review. And so doing that, right, it's that kind of spending, in theory, might be really stimulative. But given that it was going to come sometime in, 2018, it was not really very helpful.
Right, and I mean, I think that's why. Yeah, I don't think we're disagreeing here, and I mean that's why I thought, okay, so you can do tax cuts, and that'll work, and maybe payroll tax cuts, which might satisfy people because they would be cutting a regressive tax, which would be progressive, and then maybe everybody can be happy about that, And I kind of thought one advantage of huge payroll tax cuts was that nobody would seriously think that they were forever. So with the Bush tax cuts, there was this huge sort of effort in that, on the one hand, they sold them as Keynesian, which would mean that you have them for a while and then they go away. But on the other hand, the way that they were structured and the way that they were sold later, it was clear that people wanted them to be permanent, right?
Right.
And so that doesn't quite jive. But let's say you said, oh, we're going to suspend the payroll tax for 6 months or something, like right at the start of the recession, push a bunch of cash into people's hands, push a bunch of, and I would have said for businesses too, so, to drop the cost of hiring really low since businesses pay half of Social Security and Medicare taxes and consumers pay the other, or workers pay the other half. But who would have seriously argued that should be permanent, right? I mean, like who would have said, we're just scrapping half of our tax system and let's just go with that from here on out, right? And so after it was over, it would have been clear that it's over. So that would have been perfect stimulus. So I don't know. I think we kind of gotten down the road of like trying to design the ideal stimulus, but in the whole grand scheme of like, should we be worried about the current deficit? It seems to me that it's hard to, if you're a conservative, be saying, well, we should cut taxes to stimulate the economy, or if you're a liberal saying we should spend more money to stimulate the economy, but then both people then being sort of like, having this malaise over the government deficit. I mean, that's the mechanism by which all of this works, is that
in my defense, I was a libertarian who was saying that we should neither cut taxes nor raise spending in order to stimulate the economy. I mean, I'm not totally against it. I look at the political economy problem. And if we had the kind of awesome, imaginary, responsible government where we knew that this would be offset by running a surplus in the boom years, maybe go for it. Maybe it doesn't work, but over time, this is not going to be that big a deal.
Right.
But we don't. So I don't know about you, but I'm really, really concerned now about what's going to happen with the entitlement problem and the deficits down the road.
Well, see, I'm less concerned because, one, from a theoretical, just from, let's say, I think of it as a blackboard problem. So let's forget about, all the political wrangling and stuff for a second. And we, sort of look at the long-term problem here. And one of the things that I try to push or whatever, in general, dovishness on the deficit, on climate, on all this kinds of stuff, is that it's immediately clear that we have a problem right now. Our problems in the future are based off of forecasts. And those forecasts could be wrong. And so that always pushes a bias towards dealing with the actual problems that exist. So, say we have huge projected budget deficits in, 2030, right? Well, the political climate in the United States could change, and we could have, open immigration policy, 100 million workers to move to the United States, and then your deficit problem is gone. right? Or, we could have another step up in information technology productivity the same way we did in the 90s, and your budget deficit is gone. And so, you could have, you don't know what's exactly going to happen in the future. I think I made the point once that, sometimes we have these 80-year projections or 75-year projections. If you think about what was happening 75 years ago, right? So what's that now? 1940s or whatever. Basically the solidification of the Soviet bloc happened, and then it fell apart, and then we have the rise of China and the rise of Japan, and there all this stuff that no one knew was going to happen. We had the productivity slowdown. Nobody knew any of that was going to happen, and so you have to have some humility about what you think is going to happen over the next 30 years, 40 years, 75 years, and that always makes it more sensible to be concerned with problems that actually exist now than problems that you hypothesize will exist in the future. So
I would say a couple of things about this.
Okay, sure.
So the first is that demographic change is one of the most predictable, right? We're not going to get any more babies that we didn't have. And unless we go to open immigration, about which I would put such a low probability on that I don't think that...
Yep, okay.
I put a very low probability on this, mostly because, I think there are a lot of reasons. There's a lot of entrenched interests against it. It's easier to control borders than it was when we did have open immigration. We had a lot of free land when we had open immigration, and extremely high wages. So, one of the things that people forget is that for the first, sort of depends on how you do it, but certainly for the first, until the middle of the 19th century, America paid really high wages compared to the rest of the world. And so you have less nativist, you have some, right? You have the Know Nothing Party, but you have less nativist pressure about competition from low-wage workers because there's more work than can be done. And so every worker is, very clearly additive and very clearly not taking a job from someone else. Now, you and I know that over time this all equilibrates and that it doesn't take jobs from people, and that at best you see a very, very limited effect on low-wage workers that could easily be taken care of by slightly boosting some sort of cash transfer to them and would make everyone better off, right? But there's not so much room as there was in the 19th century.
Maybe.
And so I don't see it.
I think that, maybe this is, because I sort of have we can slide into public choice too now. I have a slightly different public choice view, I think, than a lot of economists. But I think, so open immigration was easier to sell in the 1800s, in part because most of the immigrants were European, right? And for a short period of time, most of the immigrants were Protestant.
People think of it that way, but certainly the Germans, Ben Franklin has some extraordinarily bigoted writing about Germans. And
but they're
the
scaled,
Jews and the Irish and the Italian and the Slavs, they were not perceived as white when they came.
Right.
And they were I don't want to say they were in the same position as blacks, because obviously that was worse. But the feeling about them was that they were a bunch of dirty foreigners, and they had all of these strange ways, and they were really noisy, and they didn't know how to behave properly. Exactly the same stuff that you basically hear about Hispanics now.
To some extent, but you can see at least I'm not a demographic expert, but just my casual reading of it seems that Protestant immigrants got less pushback than Catholic immigrants, right?
Yeah.
And so you would think that as people move further and further away from the mainstream American ethnicity, that they get more and more pushback. And so if you were just to move along that scale, you would say, well, okay, so if we have more English immigrants, nobody really cares. If you go to Germans, well, now they speak another language, but at least they're Protestants. You go to Irish, maybe some of them speak English, or maybe they speak Gaelic, but they certainly aren't Protestants, so we don't like them, nearly as much. Italians definitely don't speak English, and they're Catholic. We don't like them at all. And then you go to, Hispanics. They're not white. They don't speak English. They don't eat our food. They don't, they have a completely different culture. And so you would predict a more venomous response. And maybe you don't have one, but that would go along with.
I'm not sure the perception of Hispanics is much different from the perception of Italians. They're swarthy. They're dark skinned. They eat funny food with spices in it. I think that the main, to me, when I look back, what I really see is that the level of pushback is just related to the sheer numbers. So you get pushback when there's a lot of people who are obviously different and who are coming in. Like, so the Irish during the famine, you get, I don't know what the exact numbers coming into the United States, but leaving Ireland, more than 1 million people left Ireland in the space of 10 years. And a lot of them came here. Certainly a majority of them came here, but I don't know which, I don't know what the exact figures are. So you have 500,000 people in a country with a population where that's probably 1% or more of the population. In the space of 10 years, come into this country, they all move into the cities. They take over the political machines there. They often don't speak English. They're incredibly filthy. I say this, they're my ancestors, but I mean, they're poor. They're really poor.
Right,
they're living
poor.
like 20 people to a room in these tenements where there's no sanitation. They're not, like, as ethnic groups go, apparently the Germans and Scandinavians were in fact like more interested in household hygiene than the Irish, who tend to be more like sort of comfy housekeepers. Even when they're, when they become middle class, they're not the fanatics that the German housewives are regarded as. Not that they're dirty, but they're just not that, like, super. And they're Catholic, and they like to run politics. They take over New York, among other. They don't take over. There's lots of other ethnic groups, but they certainly have a very effective machine in New York and other cities, in Boston, legendarily. And there's huge resentment. I mean, you get all these foreigners who are coming in. They've only been here for a few years, and they want to run my country. They want to tell me what to do. They're really noisy. They don't know how to act. They're dirty. They're really poor. They're clearly uneducated. They're just like, why would we want these people here? And that's exactly what you're hearing about, right? It's exactly the same thing you hear about Mexicans. They're really poor. They live 90 to a room. They're noisy. They don't know how to act. Like, they speak a different language. They don't act like us, and they're looking for political power. And, like, that actually rubs people, right? What is the thing you hear over and over again? Like the La Raza and the Hispanic politicians, that as much as like the fact that my old ice cream shop is now called Jose's or whatever, drives people batty. You just moved here, and now you think you're supposed to take over and tell me how to run things? Who the hell do you think you are? And that is like the consistent trend of American immigration for 200 years.
Okay, so your point then is that the only reason that we had more open immigration in the past is because we didn't have the technology to stop it?
No, I think, but also there was more space, right? Like, so people...
I mean, we're running out of space in America.
No, but when the Irish come, right, they basically all move to the Northeast Coast. Not all of them, but like in very large numbers, they move to the Northeast Coast. The Italians, they move to San Francisco, they move to some cities in the Northeast Coast, etc. Well, more than half the population is living on the farm. So they're not near this. They don't care. Like, they care a little bit when it starts becoming a federal issue.
Right.
But they're not, and you notice that as the population comes off the farm, you get rules restricting immigration, and they start with things like checking for disease at Ellis Island and so forth, and then in the 20s you get extremely limiting legislation that is in fact one of the reasons that income inequality moderated until the 60s when we opened up immigration again. And so it's just not near you, right? Like, why is immigration a bigger issue in Arizona than in Minnesota? Because it's right there. And so when you perceive it as like people directly threatening your interests rather than people in Minnesota are more like, well, maybe they shouldn't come in illegally. That's not so nice. It's just not something that's like their number one voting priority. Whereas for people like old seniors in Arizona, it's like their number one voting priority. These people are right here, they're bothering me, and they're looking for political power, they're looking for economic power, and they're not acting like the people that I want to be around, mostly because they're poor. I mean, I think most of this ends up being a proxy not for like even different culture, although there's some of that, but just the fact that like poor people live in large groups and large groups of people are noisy. Right. And that ends up being a big point of contention. And it's harder to keep like your yard perfect and your house clean when you're in a large group of people.
But do you think we can say we can? I mean, that's the thing. Okay, so that's a reasonable argument that had some currency with me. But at the same time, we're talking about 40-year projections. I mean, just the organic growth of Hispanics in America is going to change some of the feelings about that. Maybe not extremely. Maybe they'll become, anti-new immigrants, even though, and so some of that will change. But just
by 1980, we have Senator Moynihan, right, passing special. They were the Ross visas. They were like basically special quotas for Irish people. They got a special extra quota every year in the immigration outside of the normal immigration system. So, like, yes, it can totally change. But I think the other point that I wanted to make is that I don't think it's a long-term problem. I don't think it's a 40-year problem. I think it's like when you look at the difference for me between the 90s and now is that in the 90s we're actually entering the boomer peak earning years. And so this is actually making our Social Security, because of the reforms that Greenspan put in place in the 80s. In the 90s, the boomers are entering their peak earning years, and for the last decade, they're in their peak earning years, right? And so you're getting a big swell of Social Security taxes. Well, that's reversing now, right? The first boomers are starting to retire. That's going to accelerate. And I don't think that the problems in Social Security start when the trust fund is exhausted. I think that the problems in Social Security start when, we've been lending, the Social Security system has been lending a lot of money to the general fund, which is everything else we do that isn't Social Security and Medicare. And when that starts to reverse, when it peaks and starts to go down, that's when the problem starts, because we suddenly are, like, basically our tax revenues are smaller than our outgo. And that's already started.
Yeah, right? To some extent, but the problem, how bad the problem is depends on how bad the outflow is, right? So, if you have...
It gets worse, but it hits, by 2030, it's basically the problem is peaking. The trust fund is arbitrary. The deficit problem from Social Security comes much earlier, and the big deficit problem starts in the early 20s. And I think part of the question is, do we consider that a now problem or a long-term problem?
Well, we consider, that's more or less a medium-term problem. We have, what are we going to lose at? I think my rough numbers on that, at the peak, that we're out maybe like 1.5% of GDP or something from Social Security, or
I think it's more like 2.1, but I don't have the exact figure in hand.
Yeah, I don't have the exact figure in hand, but okay, so that's, that's not nothing, but that's not calamity.
It's doubling payroll taxes.
Huh?
It's doubling payroll taxes, basically. It would be taking the payroll tax, sure. Social Security revenues, Social Security now consumes about 2%. It's about the amount of percentage of GDP that Social Security consumes is set to just about double, which means that, in order to pay for it, we would need to take, instead of the 12% 12.5% that Social Security now takes, 25%. And of course, there's Medicare payroll taxes, but it's basically we would have to double our payroll tax to make up all the deficits. It's a pretty big tax hike.
Is that right? I thought we have a 25%. We have a 25% gap. So I thought, if we just let things go with doing nothing, that Social Security inflows would cover in the long run about 75% of outflows, and so that would mean that we would need a 33% tax hike. But anyway, so we would need a tax hike potentially at some point. I'm not gonna dispute that. But at that point, then there's pressure to have a tax hike, and it will happen or not. I don't see that, lots of hand-wringing about it now is gonna do you a lot of good in the future. And especially if you have, so we have a massive problem in the United States, high unemployment, our GDP, a huge output gap in GDP. These are some of the worst things that could happen to an economy. And our nightmare scenarios mostly involve us, having to raise taxes so high that we lower incomes in the United States, or the United States becomes less productive, or whatever, which, may or may not be as severe as, the loss from something like the Great Recession. And it just makes sense to me to say, okay, so if we can build up enough to do something about this problem that actually exists right now, then maybe we can do something about the problem that exists later. But worrying that we don't have the courage to, in the middle of a bad problem, deal with some problem that might happen later that could be as bad as the problem we have now, that seems to be just an excessive desire. I don't mean to be too crazy, but almost like responsibility for responsibility's sake, almost like, wanting to brandish your, long-term thinking ideals, which, not to piss off too many people, but I think happens the same thing in people fretting about climate change to the nth degree more than it makes sense to. But
I find it really interesting, actually, that almost everyone, and maybe I can say that I guess I can call hypocrisy, because we can both call hypocrisy, because you don't think either of them is as big a problem, and I think both of them are really big problems we should be doing something about. But like, what's fascinating, right, is that the people who are making the arguments about how climate change is hard to predict, etc., are making exactly the opposite argument about Social Security,
right,
and vice versa, right? Both the ethical argument about how you're supposed to treat people in the future and the modeling argument. Basically, people take completely different sides, and it's completely about their ideology. It's got nothing to do with like the fact of it.
Right.
I think that they're both problems, and the reason I think it's a problem is, look, we're committing to structural spending. The problem is, like, if Simpson Bowles had gone through, I would be fine with the current deficit, right?
Okay.
If they'd even passed that thing. But we're committing to, when you tell people, like, plan your retirement around Social Security, you can't just be like, ha, we're kidding. You really should have saved some money. Too bad about that, right? You can't do that once they get... So the earlier you solve these problems, the less problematic they are. The thing that I really fear is that we get to a point where the government has not solved any of these problems, right? And that you end up in a debt spiral where debt starts jumping up, or the cost of borrowing starts jumping up, and then we really have to do something, and we've got to do something really fast. And at that point, it may not be possible to say, you know what, we're changing the benefit formula for 30 years from now. It may be that, like, we're cutting everyone's Social Security benefits by 5%. And then we're bouncing the top people for lifetime earnings off entirely. Well, the top people from by lifetime earnings didn't necessarily know this was coming, and so they didn't plan their retirement around it. And when you have to do that sort of thing, right, you either have really, really punishing, terrible tax increases, or you have to really, really hurt people and who have planned their lives around these programs, and usually both. And I think that's a problem. We're committing to spend more money than we're actually willing to tax. And we can't change our mind later.
So, I mean...
You can only change your mind very slowly on this stuff.
So this I think, gets to the heart of the issue, which is that when you say Simpson Bowles solves Social Security problem, what you're really saying is that, we're warning people in a specific way about the bad things that are going to happen to you in the future now, right? I mean, it doesn't stop bad things from happening. So, I mean, there's nothing that we could do now that's going to prevent people from getting, either benefit cuts or tax increases, right? But what we can do is we can tell them early, okay, you're definitely going to get your benefits cut or your tax increases. Maybe that has some usefulness. I don't think it's extremely useful, because the people who I think would internalize that information and modify their behavior about it are probably already aware of the problem. I think most people probably really don't think about what their retirement issues are. If we look at the number of people who are completely dependent on Social Security, what are their numbers? Something like 40-50% of all retirees. It might even be higher than that. And so it's hard to argue that these people were saying, well, I was thinking about doing some investing, but I looked at what Social Security would bring me, and I decided, it was better to go with the Social Security. I doubt that. I think they weren't really thinking about it. But here's the thing. They got old, and then they were like, crap. and then luckily they had Social Security there, and that was able to take care of them. So, I mean, and that's why I think Social Security was successful in raising poverty, or in reducing poverty, right, among the elderly. If people were completely rationally making these long-term decisions, then they should have just completely offset early savings with what they would have gotten from Social Security, and elderly poverty shouldn't have changed, because you would say that the reason there's elderly poverty is because people just don't value their retirement.
I'm actually going to disagree with you there, because if you look at what's going on with Social Security, right, the benefits keep getting increased through the 70s, when basically, as far as I know, all of the elderly poverty reduction occurred. I could be wrong about that, but I think this is... So what's happening, right, is the national incomes are going... So people who retired in 1950, they spent most of their working life being really poor, because America was really poor compared to how we are now. And then you get these big income boosts in the 50s and 40s, 50s, 60s. And so essentially what these Social Security things did was like redistribute a little bit of that income to elderly people. If those elderly people had saved to get their income in 1940, when they retired in 1940, they would still, and then they got a big boost in 1955. People didn't really retire for that long back then, but let's say this happened, right? Okay. Those people would still have had very low incomes by the standard of 1955 because national incomes had risen so much. And so, in fact, it wasn't forward-looking. It was that national incomes really increased, and we redistributed some of that money to old people by doing these staged benefit increases. I don't think, I think that people are quasi-rational, but even the quasi-rational people, right? I just actually went to the Loeb Awards. I was a preliminary judge in one of the categories, and you read through a lot of this stuff, and one of the things you realize, right, when you sit down and read 2,000 articles, is that you personal finance stuff, because they have to, because this is how journalism works, right? They have to give a number for what's there. So they say this is what your projected Social Security benefits will be about for a given income.
Right.
And they can't say the government may cut that. They can say that, but they don't have any idea how much that cut is going to be in 20 years. And so the number you have that people anchor on is what the actual projection is now. And so I think that's this is, people look at the number. They do look at numbers. If you hand them a number, they look at it. And so if you told people, your benefit isn't going to be $2,000, it's going to be $1,800, or it's going to be $1,600, or it's going to be $1,400, whatever. People would notice that when it was announced. They'd be really angry. The mobs of seniors would storm the White House with pitchforks. But there would be some effect of knowing that they needed to plan. I mean, people did used to plan, save for retirement, and now they don't. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But I do think that one of the reasons is that they're counting, especially in my generation, way too much on Social Security, because I think our benefits, certainly anyone who's a medium to high earner has to look forward to having their benefit cut. And that's just, not because I know everyone will say the real problem is Medicare, there's not a real problem with Social Security, and that may be true, but it's not just easy to cut people's healthcare benefits. We're going to be doing cuts across the board. We're not going to pick on one program. And so I think that I think that these programs are a big issue, mostly because we need to, if we're going to restructure them, we need to do it slowly, and we can't wait until the 11th hour, because if we do that, then the cuts are miserable, and that's what you're seeing in Ireland, right? When you wait until you have the debt crisis, you have to do really catastrophic things that hurl a lot of people out of work and into really, really, ever worsening circumstances.
Right. Though I would think that's not quite a parallel situation, right? So I mean, the Irish, the Irish experience is obviously exaggerated by the financial.
Oh, sure, but I it's not impossible for us to have a debt crisis. I don't think that we're going to end up defaulting, but it is really not impossible for us to have a really, really nasty debt crisis where the cost of our borrowing jumps to the point where it's not going to be feasible for us to keep borrowing, because we're going to be rolling over our short-term debt. The term structure of our debt is really quite short. It's 5 years maybe. It changes, but it's in the 5 to 6 year range. Last time I looked.
That's about right.
Which was fair enough a while ago. But when you have to roll it, so you can inflate, right? Great, you inflate for 5 years, then you got to roll your stock of debt. If interest rates jump up 6% to compensate for the inflation, that's not really very helpful.
Right. Yeah, I don't think we're actually going to be able to inflate away the debt. I don't think that's serious. But
we'll inflate away some of it. Actually, I do. But I don't think we can't do what the conservative monetary cranks are promising, which is that we're going to inflate away the whole thing. It doesn't work. It's just not actually possible. But what does that mean? It means you have to cut. Right now, when you have this big budget deficit and your interest rates jump sharply, suddenly you have to make, and you can't wait, you can't plan. You just have to be we're taking 10% out of the budget. And 10% of the budget, no matter how you do it, is really ugly and really painful. And if you don't do it, you end up like Illinois.
Right. I mean, and that's probably true. Though I doubt in America, given the way America's structured, that's what's going to happen, or that's the long run path. You're probably going to expect that taxes are going to increase, right? I mean, that would be my expectation. I mean,
it's going to have to be both, but keep in mind that this crisis is almost certainly going to come during a recession when tax revenues are falling anyway. So you're not going to be able to make it up by tax increases.
Right.
Because
so
the base will be falling so fast that you're going to have to do the spending cuts.
Right. So, I mean, I guess if you were just to say, let's make no attempt to balance revenues and expenditures well out, as time goes on, then, every year you are going to increase your probability of being, or you're going to increase your exposure to a debt crisis or to some severe financial event. And that's probably true, but it seems that it makes sense to worry about decreasing your exposure in a staged way when you're in a position that the economy is at least closer to closing the output gap. That would seem to be the logical thing to me to do. It would seem to be a politically easier thing to do, and it would seem to be the thing that's more likely to happen, right? So we had from the 80s a run up in national debt, and then Clinton and a group of Democrats said we should raise taxes, and they raised taxes. Maybe defense spending grew a little bit slower, and they ran into a surplus. Debt as a percentage of GDP started to decline, and then that seemed to more or less work, right? So it doesn't seem like it's a huge,
I feel like the Clinton experience again is so unrepeatable for a bunch of reasons. The population's growing more slowly, right? Like a lot of this is demographic. The baby boomers are going to retire. They're going to take all of their earning power out, and they're followed by my generation, which is half the size might be an exaggeration, but it's tiny, and it really, really small. It's the echo of the war babies when all the guys were overseas fighting and not, impregnating their wives, and so that generation is just going to be paying less taxes. There's no way, just mathematically, right? This is going to happen. There's no, and on the other side of this, the Clinton boom was about capital, surprise capital gains, unexpected capital gains. No one saw the revenue coming. They were projecting deficits 6 months before they got the surplus. And so Congress didn't even have time to spend it, right? And then it went away. It existed for 2 years. It was great. But Bush got the deficit down to 1% in 2007 of GDP, which is basically indistinguishable from zero, as far as I think most economists would say, right?
Right, that only would serve to reinforce my point, because I don't have a political axe to grind. But
the structural deficit. But here's the difference: the structural deficit that we have, not so Bush's structural deficit was 1% of GDP, 2% of GDP, maybe if you say he was in the boom. The structural deficit that we're facing going forward is in the 4 to 5% range. So every time you have a recession, you're going to go up to 10%.
Right, but the fraction, right? So the fraction of expenditures that are on, the fraction of tax revenue as a percentage of the economy is at near record lows, was close to record lows during Bush, and I think hit record lows during Obama, both because they cut taxes and because the economy shrank and our taxes.
It's at record lows now, but it's actually not. Under Bush, it was. As I understand it, I would have to go back and look, but as I recall, it was basically around the 19% historical average. It wasn't super. It was it was lower. But mostly for the first 3 years of his first term, when there was a recession combined with these. I agree, not good, whacking great tax cuts.
But it was lower, right? So there's room.
But then
it went up.
It went up by 2007, and it was higher. The average, I think, over his whole term. And maybe you would have to leave out 2008 to get this result, but I think the general average outside of recessions was not that abnormal, actually. The deficit averaged about under 3% of GDP, which again, post-Reagan is the historical average, and pretty close to what Clinton averaged outside of those two surplus years. So he should not have cut taxes like that. I will go, but it's not quite as extreme as that. As a matter of fact, we are now running bigger deficits permanently. Even with the Bush tax cuts expiring. If we don't let the Bush tax cuts expire, then that structural deficit goes higher. All of these projections assume that they all expire, that we don't fix the AMT, that we don't keep paying doctors enormous, keep shielding them from Medicare cuts. If you take those things out, then the structural deficit is more like 5-6%.
If you
pretty big.
So if you this sort of goes on. If you continue to vote for policies that increase the deficit, you will have a larger deficit, right?
Yes.
And that's true. right? So I feel reinforces the point that each year people are saying, should we or should we not, do the deficit? Should we or should we not, do painful things that will repair our deficit? And they're deciding not to do it. But that is dealing with the problem on a year-by-year basis. There's nothing special about saying, well, now we saw a huge surge in the deficit, largely due to a recession, and so it makes sense that we should get really serious about it now. I mean, every year you have a chance to get serious. I mean, every year you have a chance to do something. You have a chance to do something, I mean, in a fairly, perhaps not politically easily way, but mechanically easily way by stop passing laws that increase the deficit.
But the political stuff matters, right? So,
right.
Here's the thing.
So
every
that's
year
just
you
saying
delay
that people
these
don't...
choices. Right? It's like
right.
It's like the doc fix.
Uh-huh.
So
exactly.
In 1997, the Congress passed a law saying, sort of limiting how much doctor reimbursements could increase.
Right.
And in 2002, the proposed increase was in excess of that, and so this thing called the Sustainable Growth Rate, or SGR, kicked in. And Congress let it kick in, and this didn't even cut their reimbursements. It just made the increase smaller than they had expected.
Right.
And so the next year, Congress goes in and undoes that. Well, that year it was like 3% or something that they gave them. This is now ballooned to 30%, and it's impossible to cut. Right? You can't stop passing these temporary fixes every year, because it's now so big. So this is what I'm saying, is like, it's not that the deficit was 1.3 trillion. It was the deficit was 1.3 trillion in the presence of policies which keep making all of these problems worse, which keep kicking the can down the road and making the problem so big that there is no reasonable way to deal with it. And like that, had he come out with a budget that said, look, it's 1.3 trillion this year, but we've got these 5 things that are like actual reforms with teeth in them that I want you to pass. This is what they look like. This is how much they save. And this brings the budget deficit down to 2% in 2019. Great, fine. But they didn't do that.
But that makes less sense than saying, okay, do what you have to do to deal with a fairly severe crisis, right? And then as we move out of this, when the doc fix comes up and you still have, you still have a huge deficit, you say, hey guys, maybe we shouldn't do this, maybe we should scale this back. And the doctors will say, no, we're going to lose coverage, and then we'll have a debate, and we'll say, do we care more about keeping coverage for people in rural areas, or do we care more about lower taxes? And then that can be resolved. I tend to think that people will just keep pouring more and more money into medicine because they don't have it's just too emotionally difficult to cut it. And so then, taxes will slowly raise to cover that, and they'll slowly raise to cover that again. And that would be the way that the long run structural deficit would be taken care of. But saying, okay, here now in 2011, we're going to make all these promises to do things. The very fact that people failed to live up to their promises before to cut the deficit seems to reinforce the idea that this is not really worth a whole lot. These sort of long
because
range.
look at the Greenspan Commission with Social Security. They did, in fact, fix the problem for 30 years. Now it's come back.
Yeah, but
they took care of it for 30 years in a way that, had they not taken care of it, would have been catastrophic. And they did it by doing it early.
Yeah,
right? But they cut benefits 30 years in the future, and the benefit cut stayed.
Okay.
So, I really disagree that, the best way to handle this is when the wolf is at the door and you have no other choice, because that's when you have to make terrible choices. And, Obama came in promising me that he cared about all of this stuff, that he cared about fiscally sustainable. He bashed Bush on this for 2 years. His colleagues bashed Bush on this for 8 years. And it turns out that there are a bunch of big, not like I kind of suspected, but yes, in fact, there are a bunch of big hypocrites who don't care at all about the budget deficit unless it's a way to keep tax cuts from happening. And that's a problem. That is, to me, a big problem. The deficit is going to be a problem. I don't think you're disagreeing that at some point in the future, the deficit is going to be a big problem, right? They are acting like it's not a problem. The only problem was that we cut taxes. And that wasn't the problem. The problem was that taxes did not meet spending. And I feel very strongly about this, that you have to match over the budget cycle, you have to match your revenue pretty much in line, right? Okay, if you want to run a 2% budget deficit, that's fine. It doesn't matter. We'll grow out of it. Inflation will take care of it, etc. But in general, anything bigger than 2 to 3% is a huge problem that needs to be resolved. And it turns out that indeed no one cares about resolving that problem. What they care about is cutting taxes and increasing spending. And what I really fear is that I feel like politicians, what they're trying to do now, they've just given up because it's too hard, right? No one wants to be the guy who cuts. So instead what they're doing is attempting to make it so that when the crisis happens and bad things have to happen, the bad things will happen mostly to the groups they don't like. And so the Democrats know that increasing spending is a problem, but they also know they want the cuts to be as big as possible so that more of it has to be done through tax increases, right? And Republicans know that taxes are, I think, not all of them, but I think sort of the leaders often know that taxes are really going to have to come up eventually because we're not going to just end Medicare. But what they want to do is they want to cut taxes as low as possible so that when it happens, you're faced with like a 50% tax hike, and that's completely politically impossible, and so you have to do more of it through spending cuts. It's basically like a game of chicken in which both sides have just ripped off the steering wheel, thrown it out the window, and then as they do it, they look out, and there's the other guy throwing his steering wheel out the window. And what do you do in that situation?
So essentially,
you're headed for a really ugly crash.
So I guess the core, the core complaint, I guess, thing that you're having is that the way the political parties are playing this is to make the future conflict more and more intense, and therefore more and more painful or more and more collateral damage will come out of it. And I guess I would more or less accept that as being true and being an unfortunate consequence. I mean, I think my natural tendency is to think that the reason that no one does anything about the deficit is because the populace generally doesn't care about the deficit, except when they think that they can use it to say that the other side is really bad. Although I think that even that's probably the subset of people who are politically interested and motivated, and most people really don't care one way or another, and that if it became a larger issue, that more people would care, and then they would be more willing to support doing something about it.
I think that this is absolutely true. Like, I think that the public doesn't understand the deficit. They don't understand, they think, or they understand the deficit, they care about the deficit, and then all they want to cut is foreign aid, and, I forget what the other thing is. It's like these incredibly trivial $50 million a year or something that is going to do nothing to fix the deficit. To a first approximation at nothing anyway. And that's what they want to cut. They totally think that we spend this vast sums on foreign aid, and they want to cut this entirely imaginary foreign aid. And the really depressing thing is I talked to a pollster back in November, and he was like, I thought, they're just ignorant, right? And he's like, no, when we poll it and then we tell them, this is what the actual numbers are, and then you ask them to change their minds, they still say, I care about the deficit. It's really important. I want you to cut spending, and I don't want you to raise my taxes. And also, I don't want you to cut any of these. I don't want you to cut Social Security, et cetera. I don't want you to cut anything that actually costs money. I only want you to cut foreign aid. They refuse to actually make a logical choice. So yes, I think we are reflecting the voters, but I also think I don't think that's less scary. that our voters that we're basically reflecting the will of idiotic voters.
Okay, but I mean, isn't it probably the case that that voters say that they? I mean, this would be my assumption. Maybe I'm reading too much. The voters say they care about the deficit because they have some vague idea about long run responsibility and not passing burdens on to our children, and that is the morally feel good thing to say. But that's not actually what they care about, which is, having spending and low taxes, and that as it becomes as it rises as a problem, that people will be more serious about it. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, so you see, even in I think as a mistake economically. But you saw in Great Britain, sort of the not forced by the bond markets, not forced by something, the Conservative Party, really go after the deficit. You saw, maybe you think that, it's irreplicable, but you saw both declines in spending and increases in taxes during the Clinton administration. I mean, you see that there are some points where I think as these things rise in salience, people are willing to do things about them, and then the situation changes. And that's what we should be focusing on, is that, when and how will that occur, and expecting it to occur at the moment that people are unemployed.
But that's when it did occur. Realistic. That is actually when that often occurs, right? Okay. Like when people actually. So if you look at when we did this, we did, and it's actually not just Clinton. It was Bush actually did a package that was almost as big, and without him, Clinton would never have a surplus. And Bush one gets no credit for this, right?
Yeah, Bush won. But lost the election. The fact is, supposedly Bush one raises taxes in a recession, and then Clinton does it again at the end of the same. He raises them at the beginning, and Clinton does it at the end. Or like as the economy is slowing down, I should say. And Bush does it as the economy is coming out of recession. And what terrifies me is that the numbers politically, 1.3 trillion should make you focus on the deficit and think, and when you look forward and see 700 billion, or we should not cut right now, but we should really be looking for a serious way to deal with this long-term problem. And it's not. It's completely... I feel like that was why I said it's time to panic. Okay. Is that our political culture seems to have changed in some important way. I'd always basically assumed we were going to get it under control, and I don't think we are. I thought, eventually people will sort of put their house in order. And I'm not sure that... I think that we may end up having to have the bond market come in and be like, no, seriously? Time to stop spending now. And that's not going to be no one's going to be happy. Democrats are not going to be happy with what they get out of that, because they're going to have to cut spending more than they want, and Republicans are going to have to raise taxes more than they would if they dealt with it now. And that's what's really it isn't that I think that this particular deficit is a problem. I think that what I see in the political culture is that there's no interest at all in dealing with what are the actual long-term big problems, and that there's not even the seeds of it. There's not even the Clinton, the Bush... okay, yeah, these deficits are just too big and we're going to have to do something about it. And it's not a timing thing. I really don't think that, if there were... First of all, I think we're in for a bad 10 years. I mean, this is the Rogoff-Reinhardt stuff, right? Financial crises leave really long, ugly, nasty periods of either recession or just kind of not very good growth. But more than that, so, the hard choices are going to have to be, I think, made. Because part of it is that the $1.3 trillion deficit was way bigger than we'd been projecting. And that was frightening because, we had sort of said 2 years ago we were going to be out of this $1 trillion deficit thing and way down. And, okay, what happens if 2 years from now we have another $1.3 trillion deficit because it was worse than we expected? Well, that's not sustainable for very long. The bond markets are not going to continue to lend us $1.3 trillion a year indefinitely. Not indefinitely. I mean, maybe, I don't know if it's an immediate crisis. I mean, and that may be true. I mean, I don't have as good a sense about, the political dysfunction that might be occurring, and if it's so deep that nothing could be done. I mean, I know this is something that's not at all going to resonate with a lot of viewers, but I was sort of heartened, and maybe this was the financial market speaking, but by the fact that we passed a TARP bailout, right? So, I mean, it was this wildly unpopular thing amongst the public. Nobody wanted to do it, but in a moment of crisis, it seemed like the right thing to do, and politicians, originally voted for it, then the stock market basically expressed its disapproval, and then they turned around and voted for it. And so we got this thing above, beyond what people would have wanted in response to a looming crisis, and it was what sort of the experts were saying that we should do. And I mean, we could debate later, and I don't know exactly where your stance are for what was.
Well, I think we're coming towards the end of our time here, but I should say, look, I don't disagree. Okay. I also think that the U.S. isn't going to default.
Okay.
An actual default, which is defined as they restructure their debt on terms less favorable to creditors. I don't think they're going to technically do that. There's a lot of ways to quasi default, right?
You just think the cuts are going to be? You think the cuts are going to be much worse than they would have to be, and the tax?
What I would like is for them to do it before a crisis happens. I would like them to not need the bond market to suddenly say, "Hey guys, 5% more in order to borrow any more money." which is exaggerated, but you know what I mean. And like because if it's done with the crisis, it's going to be done quickly, it's going to be done painfully, and it's going to be done in a slapdash. Well, this is what we could cobble together on the Senate floor in 2 weeks or whatever the time period is. You know, we could have a rational discussion now, but it's not going to happen. And that part, I think, is new, and I think I am panicking about that, but not because of the particular 1.3 trillion, just more that like we're not getting it together, and you know, and frankly, look, maybe we will get it together, but if we do, it will be because there are people like me screaming, "Hey guys, there's this big problem coming. You should fix this now." And so, like,
maybe.
My job is to yell that, like, hey, not sustainable. Think harder. And on that note, I actually think we have to. I'll give you the last word, but then I think we have to sign off because we've been on for an hour.
Okay. So I guess what I'll say is that, you know, if what we're thinking about is increasing political dysfunction, increasing disability to get our house in order, then I'm much more open to that argument. I still, you know, I mean, I guess this is my economist leaning or whatever, tend to think that, you know, politicians, you know, somewhat function as a veil, and that the real thing that matters is, on the one hand, the preferences of the voters, and on the other hand, the power of particular interest groups like the financial industry that doesn't want to see itself like decimated by a U.S. debt crisis, and that when those two forces get together, things will happen, irrespective of whether Republicans hate Democrats or Democrats hate Republicans. But I'm open to that we're in a new world of such severe political dysfunction that process won't sort itself out. So I think that's my closing.
Well, I certainly hope you're right. And anyway, it was an awesome discussion as always, and I'm hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Yeah, hopefully. Catch you later.
Cheers, Internet.
Just